Tell people what happened here with Brett Favre, the most appalling of the details. And where did this start for you? Because I feel like this was the latest story, but this is the second time that I've read about Brett Favre stealing from the poor. This one just seems to be more thorough or more advanced on the timeline than the first time that this came out.
Right. So we broke a story back in 2020, so over 2 years ago. Right after 6 people were arrested within this welfare scandal. And one of the charges within those indictments was that this nonprofit founder took $2 million from the welfare program and invested it personally in a pharmaceutical company called Prevacus that was developing a drug to treat concussions. And I don't know if you've seen this media, but Brett Favre was very much a spokesperson for this pharmaceutical company. He was going around telling people that, they needed to invest in it because it was going to be this revolutionary drug that was going to, help athletes, prevent brain damage from concussions. And we were able to tie that to Brett Favre at the outset, and not just tie him to this pharmaceutical company, but then also realizing that this $5 million that went to build a volleyball stadium at University of Southern Mississippi was also a project that Favre was pushing. And that kind of just informed how our welfare program was operating, that someone like Brett Favre could come in and have so much influence over how the money was spent. So that was in 2020. And then all along the way, we've sort of learned, it's been kind of a trickle of information out that we've learned more and more about how he communicated with these welfare officials to make this happen. Back in April, we published what I think are some of the most explosive pieces of communication, where Brett Favre was offering the governor stock in the company in exchange for his help, and telling the governor that they were getting this money from the state. And 2 days after the governor, former Governor Phil Bryant, left office, he agreed by text message to accept the stock in the company. And that story didn't really reach the national airwaves, but fast forward to today. Just last week, we published text messages that show that give a little bit more insight into his thinking around the volleyball stadium, where he was communicating with the nonprofit founder who had this money about moving the money to the volleyball stadium. And he even said at one point, if you give me this money, will the media find out how much and where it came from? And I think that kind of communication showing how they were operating in secrecy has been sort of what has captured the national attention so much. But at the end of the day, this has been a more than 2-year process in trying to determine how he was involved. And we've been there every step of the way.
How did you get those texts?
Well, reporters can't reveal their sources. These most recent texts were filed into the court system. So there's been different sourcing for different text messages, but these most recent texts were filed in a court case.
The reason I asked the question, I wasn't looking for your source. I'm looking so that the audience can know. I did not know whether it's, whether this was within freedom of information. It's odd to have someone caught so red-handed that they're asking the person that they're committing the crime with, no one's going to know where the money came from or that it's tied to me, right? You don't usually get that kind of admission.
Right. So these most recent text messages were gathered by the attorney for Nancy New, who's the nonprofit founder that was spending this money. But most of the other text messages that I described have been gathered by investigators. And so they are part of the investigative file that the FBI, has possession of and is continuing to use to investigate this scandal.
Nancy New, she pled guilty, right, to 13 felonies within this welfare scandal?
That's right. That includes fraud and bribery and even a RICO charge, racketeering.
And she is doing this because there are people above her who know things, right? She's not at the top of this.
That's right. She, at the very beginning, the state auditor who investigated the scandal initially really put all the focus on Nancy New and the former director of the Department of Human Services, who was a Phil Bryant appointee, John Davis, and really kind of made the story about them, about the scheme that they were perpetuating. But, more and more we've learned that they were really taking orders from the top. Certainly, Nancy New didn't necessarily have a relationship with Brett Favre that she was willing to put, so much of her life on the line for him. There were other people involved. And I think she received a pretty generous plea deal back in April after our stories first published. That only suggests that she's got information that they find valuable on people higher up the chain. And she's working with prosecutors at this point. I feel like her position is that she's already pled guilty. She doesn't really have that much to lose. So at this point, I think she's willing to, get the real story out there and just, make sure that the public knows the truth, that she didn't act alone.
Anna, what was happening here? Is Brett Favre just close with the governor and he can just call in favors?
That's what it appears to be. There is a missing piece of the timeline here that has come out more recently. We know that Brett Favre met with welfare officials in July of 2017. And at that initial meeting, John Davis, the head of DHS, immediately verbally committed $4 million to the project. This is a state agency head. This is a bureaucrat. He's not going to do that without, some reason to do that or some approval to spend $4 million of state agency funds. He answers directly to the governor. So we don't know, exactly how that meeting got set up, but I don't think it was Brett Favre's idea to target the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. I don't know that Brett Favre knows or knew what TANF was. So someone had to make that connection for him.
Is Phil Bryant just a fan of the quarterback? Is the governor just fanboying?
That's a good question. I mean, I think going back to what I was describing earlier, this fund was such a target for abuse, such a target for manipulation that, they could have used the money on virtually anything. And so when you think why would the state leaders of this state do this for Brett Favre? I just don't think they thought that it was that big of a deal. Brett Favre's kind of like Mississippi's favorite son, right? In Mississippi, where we rank 50th in so many bad things. And one thing that we actually do pretty well is we produce some pretty good athletes, and we exalt those athletes. We exalt celebrity in this state. And I think our state leaders in particular, Phil Bryant, they wanted to use their position to ingratiate themselves and feel close to people that made them feel important and powerful.
Is Southern Miss any good at women's volleyball? Is his daughter good at volleyball?
I'm not a big sports person, but it's actually really funny you bring that up, because I heard an interview that came out before our initial stories published in April, where Brett Favre was talking about this volleyball stadium and talking about the program at USM. And it's not going to be a direct quote, but I remember him saying that, in most cases, the program comes before the facility. So he was saying that in most cases, a university will have a really good team, will have a really good program and be doing really well. And then they'll get this really nice facility. And then he said, USM is different. We have this really nice facility. We don't quite have the team yet. And so it sounds like he was saying that maybe they haven't been very successful, but that they have these really great facilities that had nothing to do with them being a great program, but had everything to do with, having Brett Favre in their corner and welfare officials in Mississippi.
And I want to explain to the audience, perhaps they know this, but I don't think they do, the amount of work and effort that goes toward chasing these injustices down, the resources. How much defense was played against you to make sure that you couldn't get at the truth here? Because nobody wants you to, these people don't want to be exposed this way.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I can't even describe all of the roadblocks that I received, that I was up against in trying to get this information from the Department of Human Services long before there was any indication of a scandal occurring, right? I just was very innocently wanting to know what we were doing with this money and how we were helping people. And frankly, they had no information about, the people that they were serving. So there was no information about how Nancy News organization was helping people out of poverty. There wasn't data on how many people got jobs or how much money people were making after exiting the program. There just wasn't really anything there to show for. And I was trying to get expenditure reports, and I've been calling it gaslighting, because they would send me things that didn't really make any sense. They weren't what I was asking for, but they would never get on the phone with me. I could never actually talk to another human. So I was just sending email after email, please tell me how you're spending this money. I just want to know that it's helping people. And, I can recall one public records request that I got that could have potentially, if it were actually responded to, we could have probably learned a good bit earlier on than we did, but they charged me, several thousands of dollars, or wanted to charge me several thousands of dollars that I just couldn't pay for the records. And that's a pretty typical, delay tactic, or obstruction tactic that state officials use to prevent public information from getting out.
How much were you lied to?
And I was thinking about this text message that I sent Brett Favre in early 2020, while I was breaking the stories about his involvement with the pharmaceutical company and also the volleyball stadium. I asked him very simply if he had ever had a conversation with the governor about the volleyball stadium, and he said no. And that's in a text message. I mean, that seems like a pretty simple thing, but that's a pretty big lie that we now know, only just found out, really this week on paper, have proof that that was a lie. And it has been that constantly throughout this process.
I would imagine, given the story, the way that you're telling it, you're coming in with the best of intentions. Let me report on whether funds for the poor are getting to the poor and how. Let me just get at the truth of this. And you had no idea that Brett Favre's name would scroll across your desk. You didn't even have any interest in that, right?
That's absolutely right. I never really thought that the stories that I told were going to be very sexy or very well read. I just was passionate about getting to the heart of the issue of poverty in Mississippi, because I had started out, earlier at the Clarion Ledger, the statewide newspaper, reporting on healthcare. And that was a beat that I really cared about. But I kept coming across this scenario where I would be reporting on healthcare issues, healthcare billing. And the real problem was poverty at the core. Poverty kept being the overlapping factor that would, it was really the sort of the root cause of so many of the things that I was writing about. And no one was just purely writing about poverty. And so that's what I was trying to tackle. And the simplest way to do that, in my mind, it seemed to be tackling public assistance programs. What is the Department of Human Services doing for people? And that's really how all of this began.